famous European philosopher called Benjamin Franklin America's first philosopher. This series, this program, the first in a series on Benjamin Franklin, will focus much more on Franklin the practical philosopher than on Franklin the founding father. It is interesting that many academic philosophers deal with very abstract questions, often having nothing to do or very little to do with everyday living. Well, Franklin is not in that tradition. Franklin, as a philosopher, is in the Socratic tradition. Socrates believed that the most important question any person can ask himself or herself is this: how shall I live? And if one reads Franklin's autobiography or some of his other numerous writings, one inevitably comes to the conclusion that Franklin also believed that the most important question we can all try to answer for ourselves is, how shall I live? Franklin's autobiography gives expression to much of his practical philosophy. His autobiography, as perhaps you know, is one of the most famous ever written. Indeed, it's been translated into many languages. Among the topics Franklin discusses in his autobiography are the following. He mentions that as a very young man, in his early 20s, he developed a self-improvement. He drew this up to, again, obviously improve his life, and he states that his self-improvement plan included 13 specific virtues which he desired to cultivate. Franklin also talks about sex in his autobiography. He mentions that as a young man, he had frequent intrigues with low women. Those are his own words, frequent intrigues with low women. Indeed, Franklin had an illegitimate son, a fact which he never tried to conceal. And later in life, many people considered him to be a ladies' man. Indeed, into his 60s, 70s, and even 80s, some considered him to be a ladies' man. Did Franklin have sex after getting married? And he had, by the way, a marriage that lasted more than 40 years, which ended in the death of his wife. Well, there is no hard evidence suggesting that Franklin was ever sexually unfaithful to his wife. What I will try to focus in on today and in some future programs is, what are some of the conclusions Franklin came to concerning human sexuality? What advice does Franklin give us concerning sex? Franklin also had much to say about religion. While he was never a regular churchgoer, Franklin did contribute in Philadelphia to the building funds of many churches and even a synagogue. In his autobiography and in some other writings, Franklin tells us what his attitude was towards religion and God. And one of the things I'll be pointing out and enumerating about concerns Franklin's attitude towards religion and God. Franklin also talks about the art of conversation. Franklin was regarded as a charming, interesting conversationalist. And in his autobiography, he gives advice as to what we might all do to improve our conversational abilities. Franklin also addresses himself to the subject of morality. And one of the questions he raises is this: in this life, does being a good person, a virtuous person, increase or decrease our happiness? It is interesting that there have been people over the centuries who have believed and have expressed the idea that being a good person actually makes us less happy. Machiavelli, in The Prince, indicated that ruthlessness and deviousness can often help people advance their careers. He was talking primarily about politics, but he certainly implied that this applies to other fields as well. And you might recall the comment of the very famous baseball manager Leo DeRocha, who said this: "Nice guys finish last." Did Franklin believe that? I'll be talking about his response. Franklin also talks about politicians. Franklin himself was a politician, among many other things. He was elected to the Philadelphia Assembly several times, and late in life had a job which was tantamount to being the governor of Pennsylvania. Franklin, of course, besides being a politician, was a scientist, a diplomat, and a writer. In his autobiography and some of his other writings, he tells us what he believed were the motivations of politicians, the various motivations of politicians. Franklin also zeroes in on job advancement, and one of the questions he raises is this: which is more important in trying to advance your career, what you know or who you know? And finally, Franklin addresses himself to the subject of spirituality, the idea of becoming a spiritual person. Is going to church or synagogue or mosque indispensable to becoming a spiritual person? In other words, can one be a spiritual person if one does not participate in organized religion? I'll be providing Franklin's answer to you. First, an overview of Franklin's life. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706 in Boston. He was born 70 years before the Declaration of Independence. His formal education was quite brief. He had approximately 2 years of formal schooling, just about the same as Abraham Lincoln. With regard to his marriage, Franklin had a common law marriage to Deborah Reed, which lasted more than 40 years, and which I indicated before ended in the death of his wife. The reason, by the way, he had a common law marriage is that his wife was already married, her husband had deserted her, and she did not know whether he was still alive, so that Franklin and his wife never, for example, had a church ceremony. The Franklins raised Franklin's illegitimate son, and by the way, the illegitimate son was not a product of this marriage, of this common law marriage. And besides that child, Benjamin Franklin had a daughter and a boy. The boy died at age 4. With regard to Franklin's work, Franklin opened his own printing shop in Philadelphia in his early 20s, and later began what turned out to be the New York Times of its day. Franklin became the owner of a newspaper called the Philadelphia Gazette. The Pennsylvania Gazette. And also, he became quite famous as the publisher of Poor Richard's Almanac. Indeed, the book became so popular that Franklin became a wealthy man in that the book was selling about 10,000 copies per year. Perhaps you are familiar with some of the maxims that have come out of Poor Richard's Almanac. Franklin retired at age 42, which turned out to be the halfway point in his life. What did he do for the remaining 42 years of his life? Well, he became a rather famous scientist. Indeed, he invented the lightning rod and also bifocal glasses. And of course, he continued to write. In fact, some of his biographers claim he may have been the best writer in the colonies. And of course, he is most well known to Americans as a diplomat. He served as an agent of the colonies and later of the United States to both England and France. And one of his most notable achievements was the alliance with France. You recall that during the American Revolution, France came to our assistance, providing money and troops to the United States. And some historians feel that without French assistance, we probably would not have won the American Revolution. And again, it was Benjamin Franklin who who was able, through his diplomacy, to achieve this alliance with France. Franklin died in 1790 at the age of 84. I'd like to focus in on Franklin's self-improvement plan. I indicated to you that Franklin in his early 20s, drew up this plan. And in his autobiography, he tells us what it was all about. Franklin says he wanted to cultivate 13 virtues, and among these virtues was temperance. Franklin zeroes in on eating and drinking, and he says this: eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Franklin's emphasis on temperance and his desire to cultivate this virtue is somewhat reminiscent of Aristotle. If a slogan could be attached to Aristotle and his philosophy, it would be this: nothing in excess. And indeed, so many famous thinkers have talked about the importance of temperance in everyone's life, and how important it is for all of us to try to cultivate this virtue. The great philosophers say that when it comes to eating, drinking, sex, and many other things, that we should not consume as much as we desire, but rather consume as much as is good for us. Franklin says that besides temperance, another virtue he was determined to cultivate was industry. And this involved using time wisely. Franklin says this in his autobiography, and this is advice he wrote to himself as a young man and reports about in his autobiography. He says, "Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful." Franklin contended that laziness is not the path to a more fulfilling life. He believed we are happiest when we are focused, engaged, and concentrating. It reminds me of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks believed that one of the things we should do on a daily basis to use our time wisely was to exercise the body and the mind. What tips would you give someone about using time wisely? Franklin claims he also wanted to cultivate the virtue of silence. That's right, he considered silence to be a virtue. Franklin believed that silence can often be better than conversation. He believed that most of us talk too much. And it's interesting that so many of the famous thinkers have claimed that silence is essential to the ability to think clearly. And indeed, so many religious thinkers have said that there is an indispensable connection between silence and spirituality. In fact, Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist monk, said that the silence of the monastery spoke to him, and spoke to him more eloquently than any voice had ever spoken to him. This also reminds me of a comment from Joseph Campbell, the famous professor of mythology. Campbell, who claimed he did not believe in a personal God, nevertheless said that when he was in France, he often liked to go to the cathedral at Chartres, especially when there was no service in progress. He said he enjoyed just sitting in the church, in this cathedral, when it was very quiet, because the silence and the architecture of the cathedral helped pitch him to higher levels of consciousness. Franklin, under the rubric silence, in his autobiography says this, and I'm quoting him: "Avoid trifling conversation. Speak what may benefit others or yourself." Franklin also emphasizes the importance of being a just person in his autobiography, and indeed says that one of the virtues he worked at cultivating in his life was that of justice. And he says this: "Wrong none by doing injuries, But he continues on to say that it's not enough that we avoid hurting others. He says that we have a duty to help others. We have a duty to fight for justice in this world, and therefore, when one is trying to cultivate the virtue of justice, it means, again, not just avoiding hurting others, but actively fighting to make the world a just place. Franklin said that one of the things he was most interested in doing in life was living usefully. Living usefully. Indeed, he wrote this, and I'm quoting him: "When my life is over, I would rather have it said that he lived usefully than that he died a rich man." Another aspect of Franklin's self-improvement plan was his desire to cultivate the virtue of tranquility. That's right, he considered tranquility to be a virtue. And among the things he says in one way or another is this: Franklin tells himself and others, don't sweat the small stuff. Here are his own words: "Be not disturbed at trifles, or at accidents, common or unavoidable." Franklin points out that unpleasant things happen to all of us. They are unavoidable in life. He also points out that life rarely works the way we want it to work. This reminds me of a very famous Chinese book of wisdom, the Tao Te Ching, which emphasizes the idea that we shouldn't try to force life to work in a way in which it won't, and that we shouldn't try to change what can't be changed, because our efforts will only result in great frustration. The Tao Te Ching compares life to water, and its main advice is that we should learn to go with the flow, that life is less frustrating when one learns to go with the flow. What do you think we can all do to become more tranquil? Indeed, I think it's fair to say tranquility does not come easy to most of us. Thoreau, in his journal, wrote this: dis-ease is the rule of our terrestrial life. What have other great thinkers said about becoming more tranquil? What advice have they given? Well, so many of the great thinkers emphasize the idea that if we wish to be more peaceful and less anxious, it's very important that we have a good conscience. It's very important that we try to be a just person and therefore have a good conscience. That a good conscience is indispensable in trying to become a more tranquil person. There is a French proverb I very much like, and it says this: "A clear conscience is the softest pillow." And Montaigne, very famous French philosopher, put it this way. Montaigne said, "A generous pride accompanies a good conscience." Besides a good conscience, what else can be helpful in our efforts to become more tranquil? Well, the great thinkers say that if we can learn to concentrate, if we can learn to focus, that can be very important. It could mean concentrating, focusing on our work, on a book, on carpentry, or some other work with one's hands. It could involve concentrating on music, on cooking, numerous other things. But the idea is that when we are concentrating, when we are focused, we can kind of drive the noise out of our heads, the distractions out of our heads, and therefore be more tranquil. So that, again, there is a connection, the great thinkers claim, between the ability to concentrate and the ability to be tranquil. Another tip that the great philosophers give is that if we wish to be more tranquil, we should diminish our desires. They claim that our desires are a cause of anxiety, and that one of the chief desires we have that causes us much disquietude is our desire for the approval of other people. And the great thinkers are practically unanimous in claiming that if we show less interest in wanting the approval of other people, this will inevitably lead to greater tranquility. The idea is we should be fair to other people, but we should not be their prisoner in the sense of wanting their approval. Lao Tzu, famous Chinese philosopher, put it this way: care about other people's approval and you will be their prisoner. The great thinkers also urge that if we wish to be more tranquil, it's very important that we think for ourselves. The idea being that society, today for example, in the form of TV, advertising, and other aspects of our society, can actually corrupt us. The idea is that the majority is usually wrong. I think I'm accurate in saying that all the great thinkers believed that the majority is usually wrong. Even those great thinkers who believed in democracy believed that. But nevertheless believed in democracy because they believed of all the alternatives concerning the kind of government a society can have, that democracy was the best, or maybe the least worst, so to speak. In fact, Winston Churchill, you might recall, said that when one thinks about what democracy involves, it's very, very messy. But he said that when you compare democracy to all of the alternatives, it then begins to look very good. The great thinkers also claim that if we want to be more peaceful, we should cultivate our uniqueness. Emerson put it this way, and I'm quoting him: "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." And Thoreau, in Walden, in very famous words, said this: "If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music he hears, however measured or far away." And we know that Jesus warned about the dangers of conformity. Theologian Paul Tillich wrote about the courage to be oneself. And of course, something else that can contribute to a more tranquil life is physical exercise. Indeed, recent studies indicate that for people who are moderately depressed, physical exercise, in the form of walking, for example, can be more effective than tranquilizers. Again, for moderately depressed people, some studies have indicated that physical exercise can actually be more effective than tranquilizers. Seneca, a very famous philosopher of antiquity, wrote an essay entitled "On Tranquility of Mind," and some of the recommendations that Seneca makes for helping us to become more tranquil are the following. He says, we need a balance between solitude and society. He says it's important that we withdraw from people and be alone and enjoy the pleasures of solitude, but that it's also important that we return to people and enjoy society. But he claims that we need both in life, and each person must determine for himself the proper balance between being alone and being with other people. Seneca also says that if we wish to be more tranquil, we must avoid certain kinds of people. He says that some people are bad for our state of mind. Specifically, he talks about malicious people and also people who are chronic complainers. He suggests that we avoid their company. Finally, Seneca says that we must face up to the fact that life is difficult. Remember, Seneca was a Stoic, and the Stoics believe that life is difficult. And until we acknowledge that, life will involve many frustrations that perhaps we could avoid. The Stoics believed that if you start with the premise that life is difficult, it will all be much easier. Franklin, in his autobiography, says he also wanted to cultivate the virtue of chastity. he was interested in moderation in sexual behavior. And he says this, and I'm quoting Franklin: "Rarely use sex, but for health or offspring, never to dullness or weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace of mind." This reminds me of Sigmund Freud. Freud was a very liberal person when it came to sex, and he urged more liberal laws and customs. But nevertheless, Freud believed that sublimation was essential to the good life. By that, I mean that Freud believed it was important that we channel a lot of our sexual energy into other activities. It could be our work, it could be a hobby, could be reading, could be numerous things. Franklin's attitude towards sex also reminds me of Aristotle's. Aristotle, as you recall, believed that we should approach life in the way that we experience nothing in excess. Nothing in excess. Finally, Franklin wanted to cultivate the virtue of humility. And here, in his autobiography, he said it was his desire to try to imitate Jesus and Socrates. In my next program on Franklin, I'll have much more to say about his efforts to imitate Jesus and Socrates. But let me bring this to a close. First of all, I wish to apologize to Maria Fiorelli of the Staten Island Institute of Arts and Sciences. In recent weeks, we ran a graphic at the end of the program, and I'm sorry to say that we misspelled Maria's name. So again, I apologize to her, and in the future you can be sure we will get it right. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau wrote the following: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."